All right, it looks like we're getting ready to get started. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Nina Moyni. I'm a reporter at Minnesota Public Radio, and I'm very, very honored to be here today during this part of our dialogue. We're going to be talking about immigrants, refugees, religious and ethnic minorities, and the First Amendment. And, for me, I grew up here in the Twin Cities. My parents are from Iran. They left Iran, they went to Denmark, where my sister and I were born, and then we immigrated again as a family to the United States. So I never take it lightly that we're super fortunate to be here and having this conversation about the First Amendment and all of our different communities here in the state of Minnesota, and just how all the different areas of our life really intersect when we're talking about the First Amendment and wanting to empower different communities here within our state. So I'm very excited to get started. I do want to just run through our different panelists who are all brilliant in bringing a different perspective for our panel today. So I'll just start down at the end with Chao Zhang, managing editor of Sahan Journal and awesome all-around journalist. We've all been following his work for years. He was with the Star Tribune for a long time. Amna Khalid, who is a history associate professor at Carleton College. Thank you so much for being here. Council member Jane Prince from here, St. Paul's East Side, here with us today, a very vibrant and beautiful community on the East Side. So very excited to hear about that as well. And we have Veena Iyer, who is executive director of the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. So thank you all again for being here. We'll take questions at some point today, and we have about an hour, so we'll just jump right in. So Veena and I were talking a little bit before our panel began, and you said something that I thought was really profound, which is that you said, we can talk all day about the First Amendment, really, and all the wonderful rights that people have there, but when people are uncertain of their legal rights, their legal status, it's really hard to have anything really come to fruition in your life when we're not sure about that. So would you like to talk a little bit about, sort of from your perspective, where are we at in terms of making sure that people, newly arrived immigrants, people of different minority groups feel that they are able to be heard and represented when something is going on in their lives?
Thanks so much, Nina, and making sure the mic works. Thanks so much to Nina, and thanks so much to all of you for having me here today, to McKnight, to Georgetown. I feel really privileged to speak about this really important topic. I think it's hard. I think a lot about the experience of the immigrants and refugees in my personal life, as well as in my professional life. And I think about the fact that for them, the First Amendment can feel quite theoretical. That it is something, it protects all persons. I'm an attorney. Yes, it protects all persons. But if you are somebody who lacks status, who has precarious status, the idea that you can speak about the issues that matter in your life, that you can forthrightly share your story, both in its joy and its great pain and suffering, with the community, and not be targeted for that, targeted by ICE, targeted by the police, etc., is just not something that's a reality for most people. And so I think that as a result of that, we certainly have, I think, so much work, especially being done in this community, to uplift the stories of immigrants and refugees. Nina's team at NPR, Chao's team at Sahan, so many different organizations that are trying to really focus in on those stories. But one of the things, and actually talking to one of our board members, Riham Fashir, who used to be at NPR, is she talked about the fact that when she was at NPR, she had to go back to the same sources oftentimes over and over again. And they were sources that had some sort of protection. Me, the executive director of ILCM, who was a native-born citizen, kids of parents who are undocumented or precariously documented, because those are the folks who felt comfortable enough to speak. And I would say that all of us try our very best to be accurate in our communication of stories that have been entrusted to us. But we also know that we are, part of it is not even the reliability of the narration, but the importance of hearing stories from the people who have experienced them. And so, do I think certainly right now, are people more comfortable speaking in a Biden administration than in a Trump administration? Absolutely. But also people know that there's a possibility of another Trump administration. And so that, I think, also dampens people's comfort in speaking. So I think we're at a hard point that, despite the fact that there are forums that have been created to uplift immigrant and refugee stories, it doesn't necessarily take away the fear.
Is there something that you're noticing with any specific communities right now? You mentioned DACA, you mentioned just the different communities that are in maybe just our state. Take Minnesota, for example, that is specifically challenging to ensure. Is it fear of coming forward when you're talking about giving people the legal services that they need? What are some of the barriers there?
Absolutely. I think one thing that is great, people, I think, do feel comfort in coming to us as an organization, to other legal services provider. And I think actually because of tremendous protections of something that's a little bit different, but the attorney-client privilege, it is, the fact that we still have it and the fact that it is protected is unbelievably important, because it has also, I think, been under threat. And to me, that to me is actually taking my wannabe law professor hat on. I feel like it is kind of a part of that freedom of association within the First Amendment that protects that as well. But as far as speaking about one's experience, I think that people have, for example, the driver's licenses for all movement, which has been amazing here in Minnesota, resulted in driver's licenses which are going to start being issued October 1st to anybody regardless of immigration status. There were a ton of people who were undocumented who testified at the Capitol, and I am just amazed by that. And that's because I think so many elected officials, Councilmember Prince, others who made it so that people felt comfortable speaking in public spaces about these issues. And at the same time, we have reporters who are doing, there was a reporter who was doing an article and wanted to feature somebody who had worked with ILCM, but she had status, but she was like, my parents don't, I only want to use my first name. And so that definitely is still a limitation among undocumented communities in particular.
Yeah, and I think that's going to impact maybe 80,000 or so people that would qualify for that. Councilmember Prince, again, you work with a lot of different communities within the area that you represent and within the city of St. Paul. What do you think, from your perspective, are some of the ways that it's important to engage people, whether they're eligible to vote or not, to make sure that they feel represented where they live?
There it is. I represent the south half of East St. Paul, and we are a community of immigrants, and it started with in the 19th century when Swedes moved into the so-called Swede Hollow, which is now a city park, but the Swedes were followed by the Germans and the Italians and then the Mexicans, and it was in the 50s when the Mexicans were living there that the city said this is inhabitable and burned down the community that was there, and those immigrants had to find their way in East St. Paul. It has continued to be a place where I think we have the highest percentage of Latinos on the east side, followed by the Hmong refugees who came here in the 1980s and view the east side of St. Paul as their homeland in America. It was the largest settlement of Hmong refugees and their leaders in the country. Then that was followed by waves of East African immigrants and then the Karen people from Myanmar. So when I door knock, when I'm running for election, I go from house to house to house and apartment building to apartment building, and it is truly multicultural. I mean, there are places where there are concentrations of East African people in a couple of large apartment complexes that take Section 8. But for the most part, the community is very, very diverse. And the immigrants have brought our vitality because we were the place where 3M got its start, where Ham's Brewing was one of the largest breweries in the country, and Whirlpool built appliances there, and all of those successful corporations and good union jobs left sometime by the 1950s. So having the waves of immigrants move in and settle on the east side and open businesses on the east side has really been an important economic boost for our community. In terms of getting people involved, you know, when I think about this panel and free speech for immigrants and religious minorities and ethnic minorities, I think there's probably a different story to tell outstate, but I don't want to assume that because they too needed these waves of immigrants to come and work in the food packing plants and in the turkey industry out in southwestern Minnesota. Angela Davis did a week-long series that you might want to try to hear on NPR exploring Worthington, Minnesota, and how I believe it's now majority immigrants.
Yep.
But it continues to elect only white men, so go figure. Probably because the DFL in Worthington, if it's robust at all, is not doing what we're doing in the cities. The DFL in both Minneapolis and St. Paul has been super intentional about reaching out to immigrant communities and getting them involved in our caucus process. So, you know, if we think it's confusing as people who grew up here, it's pretty challenging, but they keep coming back in greater numbers year after year. They are really interested and involved in being in the process. Consequently, St. Paul elected a Hmong woman to the school board, I believe it was around 1988. Her English skills were not good. We endorsed her, but she was the top vote getter that year when she ran. And to me, that was just such an amazing acknowledgement from the voters of St. Paul that that large new community in our schools needs to be represented on the school board. This has been true consistently. I think we elected the first Hmong state senator in the country, that was Mimua, who won in a special election. And I believe Minnesota has elected some of the first East African elected officials, both legislators and city officials. So I think that, could I say that the DFL sees that the future is going to be much more diverse than what we live in? But we're playing that out despite all my frustrations with my party. So I think that is a really good thing. And I just had the experience at our last DFL caucus in St. Paul that, and I think this was announced in 2020, that even undocumented immigrants are welcome to participate in our caucus process and be part of selecting our delegates. So it is a real commitment that the party has made. I'll I'll stop there for
Sure.
now.
No, that's great. I appreciate all the really important perspective historically and context that you're giving. It's so valuable to have all of you here for that. Veena, I noticed some heavy nodding from you while
I'm a head
Councilmember Prince
nodder.
was talking. Can you talk about, from your perspective, since it's a statewide service, what do you see maybe in greater Minnesota versus in right here in the Twin Cities? Sometimes we only talk about the immigration story as something that's local to the Twin Cities, but we know there are many communities throughout our state.
Absolutely. One of the great privileges of being the executive director of the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota is that we are a statewide organization, and actually now in North Dakota too, with offices in Worthington, in Austin, as well as in Moorhead, and we have a staff member in St. James. And until I took this job, I had no idea about the diversity that is greater Minnesota. But you go to Worthington High School and you see, like the kids letting out about now, it is majority minority. It is kids speaking so many different languages, particularly from Central America and South America, indigenous languages. So it's not just Spanish. I mean, Spanish is the least of it. There's so many different languages being spoken. And so I think and leaders in those communities know and talk about the fact that those cities would absolutely be dying today if it were not for immigrants and refugees, given the fact that the native born population has just plummeted, and the way that there has been any maintenance of population has been because of immigrants and refugees. When talking about the experience, I think from a First Amendment and speaking out perspective, I would say that I still definitely know a little bit less about greater Minnesota than about the Twin Cities. But one of the things I have noticed in talking to folks is that certainly there is more conversation now. In Worthington, there have been a number of Latinx folks who have run for office, haven't necessarily won, but are running and are extremely involved in different movements. Down in Austin, our former client actually was Obala was elected to the city council, first person of color, first refugee, I think, elected to the city council down there. So there's absolutely is more participation. At the same time, I think that there is certainly still fear, and we're just balancing between the two.
That's great, thank you. It is interesting how our state is changing, and I can remember growing up in Apple Valley in the South Metro, and my teacher asked me to bring my green card in second grade to show the other kids. So it wasn't, it definitely wasn't as diverse even there, as it is now. But when we're talking about representation in government, I think it's also important to talk about how those stories are being covered and representation in the media. I'd like to bring Chow in for that. Sahan Journal is such an incredible force and resource that we have here. Shout out to Mukhtar Ibrahim, who we know founded Sahan, worked in many mainstream newsrooms, including mine, NPR, Star Tribune, and then went out on a limb and brought something to people, by people, that is filling a great need that really should be filled by everyone, right? But thank goodness we have it. From your perspective, what is it like covering, maybe you could take that greater Minnesota versus Twin Cities angle just to start, but what has it been like just bringing this coverage to our state?
Yeah, first, thanks for having us here. Like Veena said, there are challenges to surfacing some of these voices because people might have concerns about their status. And then on top of that, most of our communities come from countries where they were oppressed, silenced, so they have a distrust of government in general, whether it's U.S. or their home country. And then we've also encountered at Sahan people who are concerned about retaliation in their home country, even though they're here in the U.S. We had an experience a year ago where we wrote about the Afghan resettlement, worked through a resettlement agency, had a native speaker who himself was a refugee, interviewed this family just about their experience being resettled. And fast forward a year, we get an email from an attorney saying, this family has some concerns about this story. It's been circulated abroad, and the Taliban is, allegedly in touch with their family, and those are concerns that all media have to take into account. We had photos of that family, names, and we believe those claims at face value and take down the article. But there are challenges to telling those stories because of all those barriers that we see in our communities. Oftentimes, some of those barriers are in conflict with long-held journalistic standards too. When we write about undocumented people, do we grant anonymity? Do we use first names, last names only? When driver's licenses for all was in discussion at the state legislature, it was important for us to kind of connect that policy issue to a human story. So we profiled a man named Lauro. We used his legal first name, who was undocumented, and sort of the challenges he faced day to day, having to drive his kids to school, having to drive to work, and all that he was putting on the line to kind of support his family. He was also a single father, risked losing his kids for driving undocumented. And so, I think the media has a responsibility to kind of tell those fuller stories, because inevitably the media, whether it's Sahan or mainstream media, will encounter these communities when something bad happens, which is oftentimes when the press covers these communities, is when someone in that community does something bad, when the cops kill someone in that community. And I think that kind of coverage can skew public perception of those communities too. This past summer, actually last summer, Sahan held a series of listening sessions with different community groups, and one thing they told us was, too often the media covers a story and makes it seem like our ethnicity is the cause of the problem versus that individual being problematic, And I think when the media can cover other stories in those communities, you balance out that narrative. And it also just includes representing them and including them in your broader stories too. It doesn't have to be an ethnic specific story. I think it's about highlighting these voices in universal stories. When Roe versus Wade was turned over last year, Sahan framed it around how does this impact people of color, who might not have access to healthcare, immigrants who might already be skeptical of Western medicine, and I think those are all things that media can do to cover these communities better.
One of the things I also love about Sahan is just the element of education that's in your work, of resources for people. We know that it is harder. I noticed a lot of city governments have, translators. They have things available in different languages on their websites. That's sort of becoming more of a resource that is helpful to all people. But I do notice Sahan in particular doing a lot of content that's like, here's how you can do this and how this applies to you. Can you talk a little bit about the motivation behind that?
Yeah, I think what we found with these community meetings is that people are really hungering for service-oriented journalism that tells them how to kind of function in the world around them. And I think news stories lend themselves to that too, in a way that can destigmatize the news event. So for example, last year there was a really tragic case in the East Metro where a young Hmong woman killed her 3 kids and then herself by drowning them all in a lake. And so what we did was not just cover it from a breaking news perspective, but talk to mental health care experts in that community, domestic abuse advocates in that community, and then list services that were specific to that community, and outside of it too, because there also is this other double-edged sword where people might not want to seek care in their community if it's super tight-knit, someone's going to know someone else. So those are all things we take into consideration when we write things like that, along with simple things like, how will driver's licenses for all function, and how to get your application in and where to get tests.
Yeah, I think in talking too about just being more representative, more inclusive, it's maybe a good time to bring Amna Khalid in. If you wanted to talk about on the post-secondary level, we know that our state's population and students are diversifying. I'm curious from your perspective how that scene looks to you now.
Thanks, Nina. I'd like to start by saying that, we've heard a lot about free speech today. And we've also heard a lot about how free speech has been denied to certain groups in the history of the United States. And I just want to say that that is indeed true, yet it remains the one vital thing that is absolutely essential for minorities to fight for their rights. It was central to Frederick Douglass, it was central to MLK, it was central to Ida B. Wells in her activism. In fact, her newspaper was called Free Speech. So although it's an ideal that's always threatened, it's one that's worth defending. It's a shame that under the Trump era, free speech got co-opted by right-wing trolls, and higher education became one of the sites where that played out. So these right-wing trolls kind of postured as martyrs of free speech and kind of co-opted it. And as a result, I feel like the liberals and the left have moved away from free speech in a way that is very, very problematic. And we need to remind ourselves how much of a core value it is for minorities. And institutions of higher learning, have always been at the center of conversations about free speech. The free speech movement was born at Berkeley in 1968. So when I think about free speech and minorities, I think that colleges and universities in particular have a very big responsibility to foster that culture of free speech, to educate minority students about what that means, and to really model that for the wider population. Now, in places like Florida, this is a panel on Minnesota, I'll try and focus on Minnesota, but in places like Florida, that is being threatened by the likes of DeSantis and legislation, which is making it impossible for university professors to engage in free speech. It's having a huge chilling effect on college campuses. But in Minnesota, I would argue that the threat is not coming from legislatures, rather, perhaps inadvertently, from within college campuses. And that's something that does bear mentioning. There was an incident here at Hamlin which made national and international news, as you all well know, and subsequently one at McAllister. And in those instances, the institutions took positions that, while I'm extremely delighted that we are welcoming minority students and paying more attention to underrepresented populations, I'd say let us not make the mistake to imagine or presume that any one of them speaks for the entire group, or that minorities speak with a single voice. Minorities in themselves are extremely diverse. And for that reason, it is imperative that colleges and universities make that space available for the variety of voices to be heard. I want to be very clear, since this is a panel about free speech, I'm sticking to the conversation about free speech and not academic freedom, another issue that often gets conflated with free speech. But for the purposes of our conversation today, I think it is vital to note that higher education institutions have a responsibility, have a very big responsibility, and even in their well-meaning actions can sometimes hurt the wider cause of free speech and free speech for minorities. I'll stop over there.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I covered that extensively, and I think that if anyone else has any aspects that they want to weigh in on, maybe it's even beyond higher education, but the idea of protecting groups that are not in the majority and protecting people who are not in the religious majority, and how I think sometimes it gets pitted against something like academic freedom or freedom of speech or freedom of expression. And that's perhaps something you would find in the walls of City Hall. You would find it when you're out as a journalist covering different stories. So I would just welcome any other thoughts that anyone might have about how do we make sure that people are not being targeted. We know things like hate crimes have risen in recent years. There's been mosque vandalism that we've seen here in our own state. An uptick in situations like that at different times, especially in the last 8 or so years. Chow, I wonder from the Sahan Journal perspective, when you are covering mostly communities that are considered to be in the minority here in Minnesota, how do you navigate that so that people don't accuse you of sort of maybe advocacy journalism, or how do you balance all of the different stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because I think there can be a misconception that media that focuses on covering communities of color and immigrants are an advocacy news organization. We cover all types of stories, including negative stories about the communities we cover. we cover hard news stories, and I think it's just about providing that balance of coverage. And we're also just providing what's been missing in the mainstream media, which is the other half of the narratives about these communities and people, and I think that's what Sahan's mission is, and I think that's how we show readers that we're not an advocacy news organization, that we are covering important issues like the Feeding Our Future investigation, which is a huge case that's, involves one of our core communities, and we faced a lot of backlash about that too. And part of our reporting has been also letters from the editor, Mukhtar, kind of explaining our coverage when the community does push back, and not really letting that, dictate our news coverage.
I think you make a good point about just transparency in our reporting processes as newsrooms, and bringing people into this is how we're doing our coverage, and this is why I think people don't have a lot of news literacy sometimes, so it's helpful to be as nuanced and transparent as you can. In the case of the situation at Hamlin, there were so many different people impacted by that. I think one of the stories, it might have been Becky Dernbach from Sahan, came and talked to students on campus who felt, well, I feel even more targeted than I was feeling before. And it doesn't matter if the numbers are enrollments going up at any institution or in any workplace or in what legislators we see, if people don't feel safer at the end of the day. So maybe that's a good way to just talk about this idea of safety in our communities. Councilmember Prince, do you have anything to say on that?
There it is. I do have to say, with the situation at Hamlin, I mean, we are Hamlin is well represented in the room, and I think we probably want to hear from President Miller. But I also think that the fallout may have been difficult, but the intention of protecting a student who was hurt is something we also want to think about. And I'm reminded, this is many years ago, my son was going to Harding High School, and at the time, Harding was about 50% kids of color and many, many immigrants. But the first Somali immigrants came to Harding High School when my son was a junior. And I always went to PTSA meetings, and we had a terrific principal, and she said, I need to tell you, I want to tell all of you here at PTSA that I have asked for direction from the school board and the school administration about what we do with Friday prayer for our new Somali immigrants and their families who don't speak English. And she said, I haven't heard back from the school board or the administration, so I want you to know that I have started to accommodate Friday prayer for our Somali immigrants. And I was just so proud of her. We can talk about school prayer, and we can talk about all the fundamental values that she was dealing with, and probably acting independently was scary for her. But that's what she had to do, and that's what Hamlin did. And I think that that's one thing that we have to think about is...
I'd like to come in here, actually. And I really do agree that I think we have a responsibility as educational institutions to look after our students when they're hurting. And when we talk about harm, I think there are two kinds of harm. There's the kind of harm, like, say, the student experienced in the situation, which she claimed. And then there's the kind of harm that she may have experienced or other people may have experienced as the fallout of the incident, which, so they're very different. That's a targeting kind of thing that's happening post-incident, in part because of how it was managed. But when we talk about harm and minorities, I think it's absolutely essential that we think about minorities, we give them the same respect that is due to majorities, which is that we contain multitudes. We have many voices. We do not speak with a single voice. And when an institution decides to take a position where it labels something Islamophobic, then it silences other students or Muslim members in the community who think differently. And these are complicated issues, I will grant, but nonetheless, in this moment, we need to be highly attuned to this because we are seeing a changing student body and we're also seeing a diversifying faculty. So I, as a Muslim, for instance, also have a claim to be a minority and to have my voice heard. And at the end of the day, while harm might be something, I don't deny that the student might have felt harmed. I think, you know, if someone's hurt, I'm not going to contest that. But we're also in the business of education. And we're also in the business of educating students about their First Amendment rights and about what are educational responsibilities and how education is conducted in a specific place. So I think, to allude to Hamlin again, you know, in that situation, I think plenty of care was taken by the instructor to accommodate minority concerns. Now, let me move to the situation at Hamlin, at Macalester, which followed hot on the heels of what happened at Hamlin. And this is why it's important what educational institutions do, because then they set the tone. And we had a situation, and I'm sure all of you know about it, where this Iranian artist was had an exhibition at Macalester, and students objected. They found it some Muslim students objected. And there were other Muslim students who spoke out very vociferously against the objection and the institutional response to close off the exhibition for a few days and then reopen it with trigger warnings and the whole, you know, 9 yards. But the point is, I applaud the intent, Jane, of being caring and of being looking out for minorities. But I also think we have to take responsibility for acting in the moment, and lest we silence other voices, other minority voices, and fall into the same identity essentialist trap that we are contesting, I do think that this is something that we need to have a conversation about.
If I could just speak for Hamlin here.
Of course.
Because the story of what happened at Hamlin University is not known to the public. You only got one version of the story. There is another version to this story that we were unable to tell. I will say this, that the federal court just ruled in Hamlin's favor in regard to this incident. So I want us to be careful in assuming we know what actually happened, because the community outside Hamlin and the community inside Hamlin to some extent has no idea what actually happened. So there is another narrative. So Hamlin did not mismanage this situation because you don't know what happened, but Hamlin did not mismanage the situation. There is another narrative, and we need to be careful of assuming we know. Again, if you remember, Hamlin did not speak. Hamlin did not speak. You only heard one perspective. Yes, the phrase Islamophobic was used. Hamlin never, as an institution, said anything about the institution, about the incident being Islamophobic. Hamlin University never made that statement. A member of the community made it, yes, but Hamlin University never made that statement. I will say that students at Hamlin University are Muslim students at Hamlin University, and we have a significant number of Muslim students at Hamlin, had a forum in December on Islamophobia. The students who are Muslim wanted to talk about Islamophobia on our campus and what it felt like to be a Muslim student on our campus. That was them putting it together and having a conversation about that. Happened in December. I just want to be careful about thinking you know what happened when you actually don't know what happened.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, for your perspective. I think that it's fair that this came up, considering what has been in our current events in the past year here in Minnesota. I think it's great that Dr. Miller's here to also speak about what's happened. I understand there are legal proceedings, and I think my observation as a local journalist was that sometimes a story takes off. Speaking of, free speech and people's interpretations, it can be used to further any number of narratives, like any other type of story that we encounter in this day and age. To me, when I covered it, I tried to do very intentional, nuanced reporting that heard from all of the stakeholders, or as many as would talk to us, because the reality is if you don't hear from the institution like Hamlin, then you don't know what Hamlin thinks, whatever that reasoning may be. Chow, I just want to go to you really quickly from, again, just in discussing the importance of local news, because I think it's fair that this topic came up, but I want to try to broaden it from this person and this person, because there are so many issues that face all of these communities in our state. How did you all decide to cover this as a local news organization?
First, I think one thing that we understand at Sahan, and I think most media companies understand, is that institutions like Hamlin will always have some limitations in what they can say, and sometimes that means the narrative tends to get pushed by the people who don't have those limitations. That can be the public, that can be a student body, and so I think we try our best to provide that holistic perspective on what's going on, but when an institution does have limitations because of its policies or personnel issues, we can only go so far in terms of telling their side too. So what we really tried to focus on initially was sort of capturing the feelings of students here, both Muslim and non-Muslims, about whether this was as big as it appeared to be, and whether there was disagreement and dissent among even the local Muslim student body. That was difficult, though. A lot of people didn't want to talk. A lot of our access was also limited because we were not allowed on campus as well. And all those factors come into play in terms of like how accurate a story turns out at the end of the day.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on that? Amna, if you had anything else? Go ahead.
Well, I'll weigh in that I did write about the piece, and I wrote in my capacity as both a university professor speaking about academic freedom, but also as a Muslim. So that's a separate situation. I'm not reporting. So, but I do think that there is, yes, you can't go behind closed doors and find out what personnel said, or what personnel issues there are. But there are things that are a matter of the public record and statements that have been made. That can and should be part of public discourse. These are important issues, and I welcome the opportunity to address them in more depth.
I think too, and not to, there are so many positive things happening too, and sometimes I feel like when we talk about our different communities in our state, it tends to be, traumatic things that happen, difficult things that have happened. We know, though, that all of that stuff is very real. We know there have been vandalisms at local mosques. We know that there have been, our Jewish neighbors have been targeted here and there for many, many years. Veena, from your perspective, what are you hearing from just different communities about how they're feeling just kind of safety-wise?
Yeah, I think that there are significant concerns about safety in so many different communities. I think both so much on the hate crimes piece, particularly among, I would say, Asian American communities here, particularly post-COVID. I think there's also so much fear among undocumented communities, among all, I think, undocumented communities with regard to police violence, other ways of targeting. I was actually going to talk a little bit about what you said about positive stories, which I wanted to make sure to share. And I do think it's positive stories of, I think, activism. One of the things I think has been, I've just been so impressed and awed by in the past several years is particularly families that have decided that they don't really, they kind of have nothing to lose. They have family members who are threatened with deportation, particularly here in our community. We saw a number of Cambodians as well as Hmong and Vietnamese immigrants here in our communities who were threatened with deportation after 10, 15, 20 years during the Trump administration. And what you saw is families standing up and speaking out and providing a different narrative story. Really, I think an amazing example is was Minnesota 8, which is an organization some of you may have heard about, which coalesced around 8 Cambodian American men here who had been caught up in the criminal legal system when they were very, very young. They were not deported at those times because, in some cases, because their offense wasn't deportable, but later became deportable. Others because there were no deportations to their home country at that time. But then, about 5 or 6 years ago, Cambodia and the U.S. Had diplomatic relations again, and they started deportation proceedings against these folks who had been here for 25 years, had families, had houses, had just established themselves and had no criminal record since that time. And their families came together to speak out against them being detained, about families being separated, and they were able to get at least a few of those people to be able to stay, and actually in some cases are now citizens, but some were deported. But in those cases, I think those families said, our community needs to know that this individual that the government is trying to deport, he's the guy who is coaching your Little League team. He is the person who is next to you on the line, working at a manufacturing facility. And so I think it's been so impressive. And actually one of those young men, he was actually the son of one of the men who was caught up in this situation, who was an ILCM client from 1996 in his original deportation proceeding to getting his deportation proceedings ended about 1.5 years ago, and has spoke so eloquently about this work, was represented by the legal defense program that is supported by the city of St. Paul and Ramsey County, and spoke out about that in order to get those services for other members of their communities. So I guess what I would also say is that in the face of fear, there's also this point where people say, I have nothing left to lose, and I'm going to use my First Amendment rights to be able to speak out on behalf of my family and others like me.
If I could follow up on that idea, because when Trump was elected, it was this just shockwave that went through the people I represent, and I heard from all of us anyone who knew, particularly Muslims, but immigrants, was hearing from them, are we safe? Kids in school, the day after the election, just completely terrified that their families were going to be split up. And St. Paul did a couple things, but it was very much with the support of the Immigrant Law Center. We decided, I think it was in 2018, does that sound about right? The city and the county got together and each put $100,000 into being able to represent people facing deportation through the Vera Institute. That was the group that we worked through. We also hired an immigration attorney, not obviously to represent anybody, but to be able to advise the city on what we should be doing about the issues facing immigrants in our city, residents, workers, and so forth. And there's a large effort afoot because of exactly what Nina was talking about, that people have been in our country, whether they were kids that came over with their parents and then never bothered to go through naturalization, that everybody really needs to, if they are qualifying to go through that process, they need to do it, and they need to do it now. So we are part of a fundraising effort, I believe, to help pay the what is it, a $250 fee for applying
for citizenship. Yeah, I wish it was $250. Unfortunately, it's far more at this point for citizenship. But what's fantastic is the city has partnered with one of the credit unions locally in order to provide an interest-free loan to individuals to be able to apply for citizenship as well. So that's another great program. And it's true. I mean, if you don't become a citizen, you can always be deported. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line. And so that is something that I think is really, really important to being able to make sure that people are able to fully participate in our democracy by becoming citizens and being able to speak and to vote.
Thanks, Veena.
No problem.
Thank you both. I do want to say we have about 15 minutes left, so if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to come on up. Come on up, sir.
Hi, thank you for the panel. My name is Mark Berkson. I teach in the religion department here at Hamline University. I have a comment and then I have a question for the panel. So in response to President Miller's statement, I just want to first of all say that we do have a knowledge about what happened extensively. There were, the AAUP came in and did an investigation. Hamline had never done, as far as I know, any sort of internal inquiry to find out what happened. But that's available, the New York Times and all that. There were investigations, so we kind of know what happened. And that statement about Islamophobia, that wasn't just made by a member of the community. That was made by a vice president who is the chief diversity officer. And if the administration had wanted to immediately retract it and distance themselves from it, they could have done so, but they did not. What was really crucial to know about the incident, because it goes to the heart of what we're talking about, is that this was not just about a student seeing an image and being upset by it or hurt by it. Because if it was, that is a fairly easy thing to deal with, right? In the sense that you support that student, you help them, you try to ensure that the protocols are there so nobody sees it if they don't want. The professor did her best, but something occurred, okay. But that wasn't the issue that blew up. The issue that blew up was that the students, along with the speaker who was brought in and some of the administrators supporting them, said that those images should never be taught in any classroom, right? That is where the academic freedom issue comes in. That's a vital part of the teaching of Islamic studies and art history. So at that point, it was about denying the right to study a certain type of material, and Hamline took sides in an internal religious debate, right? I mean, so that was the problem, was saying, we're saying that this is a blasphemous or heretical thing, and this is permitted, right? That is what a secular university, a liberal arts institution, cannot do. Is to take sides like that. We can ensure that no student is exposed to something they don't want to be if it violates their religious principles, but we cannot deprive the community of the right to see those things. You can't impose a religious prohibition of one group upon everyone. So, and the diversity of the Muslim community is crucial there, because many Muslims strongly disagreed with the response. I teach Islam, and I have Muslims in my class. Yes, and I will say that I've taught Islam here for many years. I have Muslim students in my class. I have taught these artworks, and the Muslim students there are perfectly capable of talking about them, and sometimes actually appreciating them, being in the room, and they disagreed with these other students, but they felt intimidated and silenced in that debate. So I believe that there were people who were trying to prevent students from taking my class for this reason, and that is also problematic. But let me then ask the question. We're talking here about not just free speech and the abstraction, but the institutional location for free speech. So in the public sphere, the First Amendment protects us. We can say whatever we want, right? And the government can't imprison us for us. But at a workplace, you can't just say whatever you want, obviously. You can't insult customers when they're checking out or whatever. There are norms, there are policies, right, that restrict that. And there are real consequences for speaking out in certain ways. Loss of job or public vilification. This is why a university is so important, right? Because we protect that here. So I'm just wondering how you ensure the protection of free speech in institutional locations where you have those norms and those policies and balance it out, right, with reasonable limitations on what people can say. So rather than make it an abstract First Amendment government issue, how does it work on the ground in most people's workplaces and their lives?
Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want to shut down a healthy First Amendment debate in when that's what we're here to talk about. So if this is what folks want to talk about, that's fine. But I do think there are, so many, it sounds like, other places and forums where that has and can be discussed throughout Hamline and just throughout other venues. So I do just want to ask if anyone has any other questions related to anything else. Otherwise, if anybody else wants to speak on that, again, I certainly don't want to censor anybody. I don't think that's my role as moderator, but I don't want us to get too off the rails. Sir, did you have a question? Is it about the Hamlin?
No, it will be a different question.
All right. Okay. Let's move on then, if that's okay with everybody. Is that okay with you, Amna, to move on? Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you so much for the conversation. I want to go back to something that we talked about a little bit yesterday on how U.S. projects their debates of free speech abroad. And, we can all think of the whole world is watching. And that's sort of, I think, where we find ourselves today. And I want to pull up some people that I think have interacted with the U.S. government. Maria Ressa, Filipino journalist who won the Nobel Prize in 2021 for championing freedom and expression. Recently, with the Indian diaspora in California, they had outlawed caste as a grounds for discrimination within employers. And maybe even, as far as transformative free speech goes, with President Biden visiting Belfast in celebration of the 25 years of the peace agreement. And, these are all acts within the diaspora community which have enormous impacts abroad. And you're interacting with those communities, whether they're students, or whether or not there are new migrants. Like, how do you guys see that bigger picture?
Does anybody want to speak to that? I sense your question is how different international events, different decisions that different policymakers at different levels make impact the different diasporas in our state. Is that something, do you feel like people are really informed very much about what's going on unless they're a part of those communities? Because I sometimes don't feel like people are.
I mean, I can speak, and this is just, frankly, Veena speaking as a South Indian American woman who grew up in the United States. But I mean, I feel like, definitely not ILCM. But I mean, part of, I think, what's really hard, and I think this goes back to, I think, what Amna is talking about too, about just the variety within different communities, is the idea and the issue of people in the majority community not understanding that diversity and therefore assuming there are people who are experts that are not. Frankly, I'm not an expert on very much of anything about India. Like, I'm just, I grew up here. I know a good amount about different things, but especially to ask me, I'm Tamilian, I'm from the south of India, to ask me about certain things about somebody who is from Gujarat, which is a northeastern state, different language, might be different religion, lots of different things. I just don't know. And I think that there's problems here when the majority community doesn't learn enough. And so there's the part about asking the right person to be the expert, but then also not assuming that anybody can be an expert fully on experience, and there's a combination. And it brings me back to something, actually, I think with regard to religious freedom, but not in the speech context, that happened to my dad. So my dad was a professor at a university in Texas, and there was a family in our school district who, after I had graduated, who wanted to have their kids have the day off for Diwali, which is a big Hindu holiday. And the school district didn't know what to do, and so they called my dad, who's a business professor. And Jay just asked my dad, and so my dad tells me about this, and he's like, I, of course, told them that, no, we don't take days off for Diwali. And I was like, Daddy, yeah, you didn't have us take a day off, but how the heck did you become the expert on this? And back in India, didn't you have the day off? Well, yes. So I think there's both the issues of who are you going to for expertise, but then also us ourselves having to be able to say, hey, no, I'm glad you think I'm the expert, but I'm not. I mean, I feel like I try to do that a lot in my job, and I think there are, unfortunately, too many people in our society who, out of ignorance, lack of humility, or just self-obsession who can't help but speak on things that they don't know about. So I think that goes back ultimately to the First Amendment, because again, just because everybody gets to say everything does not guarantee quality. And I don't think anybody who, supports the First Amendment is suggesting that it supports quality of speech. But it is this idea that you get more out there and you talk, but it also means that this free speech imposes such a significant responsibility on each of us to go out and whatever way we can find out different perspectives and to warn people that our own perspective is just one. And that's, I think, incumbent on all of us.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up. I think I'm really glad you've brought up the issue of expertise, which is under attack and has been under attack since Trump became president. And I think we sometimes tend to think that only people on the right or extreme right are attacking expertise. But I think there are ways in which we ourselves, like you said, are not familiar with what is expert opinion. And I think, again, we should be talking to experts to make those final decisions. And in higher education, the expertise tend to be faculty in their areas of specialty.
And sometimes from a journalism perspective, we don't do a good enough job of finding a variety of voices. It tends to just be, this is the one guy who talks for this community or this, and that there's a multitude of reasons that happens, whether it's timing or laziness or a majority population, newsroom. I do see that we have one more question. Go ahead, please.
It's not a question. I'm one of the faculty members here at Hamline University. I teach political science. I think what Veena said about a minute ago encouraged me to say this out loud. I'm a Muslim myself. I'm originally from Turkey. I was raised in a very secular environment with very secular-oriented, by very secular-oriented parents. And last year when we had the incident at Hamline, one of the things that I thought was really my appreciation for President Miller for what she did for that particular student. But as a person who belongs to a different school of thought within Islam that Mark may be talking about in theory was very much relevant to me in person, because the school of thought in Islam that I belong to is very different from the school of thought that the majority of our students here at Hamline belong to. And to me, that diversity or diverse perspective needed to be included in the decision-making process. Again, I'm not really putting the blame on anyone. I think that everyone had the best of intentions for our students and what we are supposed to be doing in our classrooms. But the way that the discussion happened or the debate happened or did not happen had a chilling effect on me personally as an academic who teaches courses related to the Middle East, courses related to women's rights in Islam, all of those things. And that may not have been the intention of our administration, which I really appreciate, again, what they did, but it happened. Now, as I'm thinking about the classes that I'm going to be teaching next semester, I have to ask myself, do I really want to talk about this? Or how am I supposed to think about this and talk about this with my student? And I, again, wanted to thank you, Veena, for what you said about the importance of diversity. And Amna, again, thank you for being here. And thank you.
Thank you. I think that it's, please, sure.
Again, I don't think most people know what happened. Certainly, most people don't know the conversation I had with the student. It is not known. It is between the student and me. It was never revealed, except as the president of the university, it was my responsibility to make sure she was okay. That's it. That's it. I think that when we are put in these positions, families, parents expect us to make sure that their children are okay when they're with us. So people don't know what happened in my office. People don't know what was said to the student at all. I will say this, that there were conversations that are Muslims, yes, we have a variety of different Muslims. However, on our campus, we have a Muslim Student Association. Those students who are part of the Muslim Student Association did speak. We have a responsibility to respect their viewpoint. Whether we agree with it or not, we have a responsibility to respect their viewpoint. That's so we can talk about the different perspectives, we can talk about whatever, but when you're in that situation, trying to make sure that a student leaves your office feeling as though you care about them, feeling as though they belong, because at the end of the day, the students are our recruiters who go back into their community and talk about their experience as students. So it is a complex situation. I hope we all appreciate that it's a complex situation. Yes, do we agree with everything that God said? No. However, again, I cannot say enough. There are things you can say in the moment. There are things you cannot say in the moment. So you didn't hear from us because there are things we could not say in the moment. So let's be respectful of that and realize that a lot of you didn't know the sermon. On campus, I don't think people knew all of the story. They knew what was told them, and I respect that. But let's be careful, because I say this, and you heard me say this yesterday at the symposium. There are consequences with things that we do. There are consequences. And they're unintended consequences. We think we're doing the right thing, we think we're doing the good thing, but there are consequences. In this instance, we had police security on our campus from January to April. We heard from our students who wear the hijab that they did not feel safe on our campus because of the credible threats that were coming in. So you didn't hear that side of it, or the fact that we had people on our campus that didn't feel safe being on our campus. So yes, I have been an academic all of my life. I have relied on academic freedom. But I also know what it's like to be on a campus and not feel safe, because I've been there in a different way, but I've been there. So I heard from our students, many heard from our students, they did not feel safe. I did not feel safe. Along with my students having police presence, I go home, there's a police officer waiting. There's one in the driveway when I'm in the house to make sure that I'm safe in the house. So when we talk about things, there are responsibilities that come with what we do and how we do it. We might not always agree, but I think we need to understand and appreciate the fact that there are consequences. I'm not saying you don't tell the story. I'm not saying that at all. But we need to be mindful of the fact they're human beings who are part of this narrative. Human beings who have to live, work, and try and thrive in these environments. And it can be difficult.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. I think just being respectful of the next panel that's going to start, we'll have to leave it there. But I do appreciate everybody who spoke today. It's clear that there are just some issues where people just don't agree, and there are different interpretations, and that is the privilege that we have in this country, in being able to have these conversations again and again if needed, and to be able to voice how we feel and what our story is. So I think we'll just leave it at that. And again, thank you to all of our wonderful panelists, and thank you to our audience members.